Hello, I'm going to entitle this video The Differences Between Moderate, Partial, and Hyper-Preterism. As I'm asked all the time, the differences in what is partial preterism, what qualifies as partial preterism, when in fact a lot of people believe they're partial preterist when they're actually not partial preterists, more moderate, you could say. And so we're going to cover the differences briefly as possible, succinctly as possible, and as clear as possible. We're basically going to focus on hyper or full preterism and partial preterism, but we're going to talk about moderate preterism. I have a stack of books behind me, which would be a partial preterism. I have a couple here, moderate preterism. I was looking for another one by Gary Gibbs on the tribulation of Matthew 24. I couldn't find it. And I have a whole bunch around here, stack here, some here on that shelf, and over here I have a few full preterist works. So I have more full preterist works probably than anything, besides dispensationalism. But we're not going to get into them right now. Basically, first, get it out of the way, moderate preterism. Moderate preterism sees a moderate fulfillment. And a lot of historicists over the years were moderate preterists. They would say, well, okay, maybe up till the abomination of desolation has a dual fulfillment, or a main fulfillment in AD 70. Philip Moreau in 70 Weeks in the Great Tribulation, and Philip Moreau is very good. I like Philip Moreau. In here, he puts the Olivet Discourse, he cuts it off at verse 28. To be partial preterist, you have to cut it off at least verse 35. You have to take at least the first 34 verses as fulfilled, or some partials take the whole Olivet as fulfilled. So a moderate preterist would not go that far. He went up to verse 28, and yet at the same time, Moreau thought this generation meant that generation, and yet he somehow cut it off at 28. I don't know how, but he did. This is by Ellen White, the prophetess of the Adventist Church, part of their 5-volume series that she did, The Great Controversy, which was plagiarized, of course. But in here, she has a whole section on the abomination of desolation. And what the Adventists, who are historicists, do is they put a double fulfillment there. She has a whole chapter on the destruction of Jerusalem here. That's interesting. So she's a moderate preterist. They would be considered moderate preterists. And she has a whole chapter on the abomination of desolation. Here's a time of trouble. But we're not going to spend a lot of time on there. So she says that the abomination of desolation was in AD 70. But it's a dual fulfillment. It has the 1260 years from 538 to 1798 was the tribulation as well, and abomination mainly, the abomination, where Rome defiled the heavenly sanctuary for 1230 years, Daniel 8:14, or 1260 days from 1530 or 538 to 1798. So that's different, obviously. But moderate preterists, usually moderate preterists, the older commentaries I read, a lot of them, they would say some would put verse 34 up to Matthew 24:34 as AD 70, and they would take maybe Revelation 6 as AD 70. Because it's clearly Matthew 24. But that would be it. They wouldn't go further in Revelation. But most moderate preterists see moderate fulfillment. They don't see major fulfillment in the Gospels, major fulfillment in Revelation. They're just Christians that would see a little more fulfillment than most Christians. They, you know what I mean? They would cut it off a little later. So that's moderate preterism. Partial preterism states that up until Matthew 24, up until verse 34, and many of Jesus' teachings in the synoptics, his parabolic teachings, other passages in the New Testament, the bulk of Revelation, at least Revelation 1 through 19, is 80-70. That's a partial preterist by definition. A partial preterist sees at least the first half of the Olivet Discourse up to verse 34 is 80-70, at least Revelation 1 through 19. Up until chapter 20 is 80-70, and some will say 21 and 22 is 80-70 as well, as DeMar does. I think he might have changed his mind on that again. So some partial preterists just leave out chapter 24 and following. So that's a partial preterist. Major fulfillment in Jesus' teachings, in the synoptics, in his parabolic ministry. Matthew 24 up to verse 34. Other areas of Scripture, and Revelation 1 through 19, the first 19 chapters is 80-70. That's a partial preterist. If you don't believe that, you're not a partial preterist. You're a moderate, or maybe a more robust moderate preterist. Now we have here Joel McDermott's Jesus versus Jerusalem, which he demonstrates. He does a pretty good job on Luke. I always thought Luke 13 through 20 was 80-70. The parables there, he goes back to Luke 9 to begin the narrative. Pretty good book on that, and he would be a partial preterist because he sees the parabolic ministry of Jesus as 80-70. And he sees at least the first half of as Matthew 24 is 80-70. I'm not too sure on Revelation. I wouldn't be surprised. As a post-millennialist, he takes Revelation 1 through 19 as 80-70. A great book, one of my favorites by N.T. Wright, besides The Resurrection of the Son of God. I would actually like this a little better. Almost half of the book is dealing with the parables of Jesus and his teaching of the kingdom. N.T. Wright, in many places here, I have it marked that Jesus did not go past 80-70. He did not go past 80-70 in the synoptics. But there's great historical information about what a prophet was considered in Second Temple Judaism and whatnot. But the thing is, N.T. Wright's not a partial preterist. I think N.T. Wright does take Revelation 1 through 19 as 80-70. I could be wrong. But he does see Jesus and Paul having two different eschatologies. But here, all of Jesus' teaching to N.T. Wright is 80-70. So N.T. Wright, that and Revelation, as I'm pretty sure his Revelation for Everyone commentary, he does take that fulfillment. Then we have Jonathan Bray, the Baptist evangelist, Matthew 24 fulfilled. He would be considered a partial preterist. And I actually think, I could be wrong, I think does he deal with Matthew 25 in here? No, I think he just deals with Matthew 24. Yeah. But at least the verse 34 verses. Gentry, of course, the beast of Revelation. Obviously, if you're taking Revelation 13 and 17 as 80-70, he's a partial preterist, and we know Gentry is. Shelton, partial preterist, we know that. Milton Terry, partial preterist. Although he did have a liberal critical view of Isaiah, took the Maccabean thesis of Daniel. I don't have a problem with that, but he was sort of liberal in some areas. Gary DeMar, of course, and I have other works there, but that should suffice. This is partial preterism right here, because they take the bulk of Jesus' teaching and place it in AD 70. Whereas the hyper-preterist, or the full preterist, says all prophecy, including the bodily coming, the bodily resurrection, judgment of the living and the dead, happened in AD 70. The partial preterist says no, there's a future coming, bodily coming, a future resurrection, bodily resurrection of the dead, judgment of all mankind, and recreation. That's the difference between hyper and full, basically. Partial preterism, major fulfillment. Hyper-preterism, everything's fulfilled. Everything has to get through that grid of 80-70 somehow. No matter what the text says, it has to go through that grid. So that's basically moderate, partial, and full preterism. Again, moderate preterism sees a moderate fulfillment in the Olivet Discourse, and maybe Revelation 6 is 80-70. Partial preterism sees more fulfillment, stronger fulfillment. Much of Jesus' teaching, his parabolic teaching especially, and the Olivet Discourse, at least the first half, is 80-70. The first 19 chapters of Revelation is 80-70. Certain time references, Hebrews chapter 10 would be 80-70. But the hyper-preterist puts it all in 80-70. That's why they're hyper, they're extreme. Trying to be consistent. We have hyper-Calvinism, which is Calvinism taken to an extreme we've seen centuries ago, which says God's fatalistic. We don't even need to proclaim the gospel anymore for faith to be worked in the hearts of men. And we have them today. We have dispensationalism became hyper-dispensationalism, or Balderism, or mid-Acts dispensationalism, where the church of Acts chapter 2 is not the same church that Paul preached to. That the church didn't really begin in Acts chapter 2, but maybe in Acts chapter 9 with Paul's conversion. Some would say in Antioch, Paul's first sermon. Some would say Acts chapter 28 is when the church started, if you can believe it. That we only have 7 letters today. 7 of Paul's prison epistles apply to us today. The rest of Scripture doesn't. Peter, James, and John and the boys, as they like to say, preached a different gospel than Jesus, or than Paul. Paul preached faith alone. They preach faith and works. So there's where consistency, or a viewpoint, preterism. We had preterism. Now we have to qualify it as partial preterism because of full preterism or hyper-preterism coming in 1971 with Max King. It was just preterism. Now it's partial. And we get laughed at, all your partial futures. No, we were the original ones. We were preterists. The new came along 40 years ago, whatever. And now it's different. So they're the ones that changed things. And they're the ones that followed suit with Calvinism and dispensationalism, wanting to be so consistent that they're not even Christian. Hyper, ultra preterist, extreme preterist. So when we see hyper-Calvinism, we run. We don't have to preach the gospel anymore. When we see hyper-dispensationalism saying only Paul's 7 prison epistles apply to us, that Jesus doesn't apply to us, none of the Bible applies to us, but Paul's 7 letters, Paul preached a different gospel than Jesus and Peter, we run. When we see hyper-preterism taking preterism to a consistent extreme, which seeps sewage into every other aspect of theology, every other branch, protology, the study of the beginning, soteriology, the study of salvation, they mess that up, Christology, they mess that up, the study of Christ, the person of Christ, ecclesiology, they don't even have an ecclesiology, the study of the church, because they have no church. They don't have... and so this is where the implications come in with hyper-preterism. And so, yeah, that's pretty much the lowdown, you could say, on the differences between mainly partial and full or hyper is a technical, proper theological term. We talk about hyper-dispensationalism and hyper-Calvinism, no problem, but when we say hyper-preterist, people get angry. That's the theological definition. It's not meant to be derogatory, but in certain videos, most videos, I'll say full preterist. But when I'm making a category distinctions, I have to say, and bringing up Calvinism and how it went hyper, ultra extreme, and dispensationalism, of course, I have to bring up that term. But those are the basic differences. Those are the basic differences. I hope I covered this many times in different videos, but I thought I would just do a video on this. But that's about it. Stay in orthodoxy. Check out our site, hoperesurrected.com, 11 contributors. A lot of us former full preterists, refuting full preterism in general, and the implication arguments bringing up in particular. So check it out, hoperesurrected.com.